I think that Dr. Mikkael Sekeres is really, really careful. He is an oncologist at Miami University, and he's sat on the advisory board at the FDA and actually been the director of the advisory board for approval of cancer drugs at the FDA. And he recognizes that he sits at the intersection of so many social needs and so many important questions. What drugs get approved and what drugs don't get approved? Who gets to use them? How do you interpret the data for whether or not a drug actually works? And so, because of his experience with the FDA, he's not willing to do what a lot of people do, which is kick the machine and just be like, everything is broken, the system is busted, we have to get rid of it. He's a voice that's like, hey, it's really complicated, and there are a lot of moving parts, and there are corruptions, but there are a lot of really, really good people that are trying to get it right.
Yeah, and there's solutions. There's certainly things that people can do. He makes the point of how some protest movements, particularly during the AIDS epidemic, were actually able to make changes happen at the level of the FDA. I think it's really important for all of us to remember that we are the numbers and we really can change things. If, honestly, if things get out of control, it's very easy for us to actually make a big stink about it. And the companies and the regulatory administrations really do end up listening at that point. So I really enjoyed that perspective, just that, we're not completely powerless, and there are directions we can move in to make things better and to weed out the inherent corruptions and biases that occur out there at the regulatory administrations with revolving doors and all. So this was a very wide-ranging discussion of the FDA and the regulatory processes, which I think will go really nicely with some of the other conversations that we're starting to have about pharmaceuticals and what's going on, who's leading the horse around.
And it's actually a bigger conversation than just about pharma and the FDA. It's also about life and death and medicine and what it's like treating people who are going through probably the worst thing that ever happens to them. And so it's really big and it's very good. And we think that you'll really enjoy it.
We really want to hear what you think, so leave us a comment or come hang out at Discord or at our Facebook group and let's talk about it. And if you really love it, share it with somebody and consider becoming a patron so that we can get this show to the next level, take it on the road, do some live interviews, and really make something bigger of this.
I know we've already been talking for a while, but I do want to add that one of the favorite things that happens is when people who like the show tell us how we can make it better.
Yeah.
And so if you watch us and you're like, I cannot believe that they are still doing this, please tell us and we will fix it.
All right, guys, enjoy this conversation. We'll see you again next week.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Science Podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
One of the challenges I face a lot, I'm a clinical researcher. So I am involved in clinical trials. I've done research in quality of life, defining value in medicine, translational research into the genetics of certain cancers like leukemia and myelodysplastic syndromes, which is a different type of cancer in the bone marrow. And the media is interested or tends to be interested in clinical science. It's very hard to communicate complicated basic science principles to the media. And part of the problem is that you'll have really exciting research at the American Society of Hematology annual meeting, and the basic scientists are so jazzed about it. And as chair of the Committee on Communications, I have to say to them, there's no way we can explain this easily to a lay audience. It's just not going to fly. I think that's the hardest part, is cutting out some of the science from how you're communicating to it, because you just know that mainstream media is not going to pick it up.
What's that like? Do you talk to these mainstream media and you can just see on their faces that it's just kind of like just blown by them, or
it's just not clicking? And I shouldn't generalize. Certain mainstream media get it. Like, I don't know if you've ever been interviewed by a reporter for like the New York Times. Oh my God, they are smart. Like they get it. They want to understand it at a deep level. They want to be able to break it down so that lay people understand things. That's like a wonderful experience, and that is the exception to the rule.
But it's like it's exactly right that it's an exception to the rule where there's some layer of publications that are interested in being able to and have the resources really to give the space to breaking something complex down. But for the most part, it's like the process of releasing of press releases and publicity and science communication seems to be this, 600 words, and then you're moving on from it as quickly as possible, and there's something else tomorrow, and it's not meant really to be studied in depth.
Or
it's
like
just
pulling
meant,
people into the discussion.
yeah, it's just kind of, they're almost like news bulletins for industry people, because there's so many PhDs at this point that it's like they're not speaking to the general audience. They're just like, well, some fraction of people are doctors, and that's who this is for.
Right. So there are trade publications, and there are a lot of them in hematology oncology because it's big business and there are a lot of people involved in it. And those you don't have to break things down as much, but you're also not having the impact with, promoting science to people and really getting the public to understand it.
That's interesting. That's actually the first scientific conference I ever went to, was that American Society of Hematology.
Is it really?
Really?
Yeah, I worked in a lab right after college doing studying a kind of leukemia, and so that was my introduction. And it was definitely a huge industrial production too. It didn't really occur to me too much at the time, but everybody walks away with a big bag full of goodies from all the vendors and so forth. It's quite a production.
Not anymore.
Oh no!
Yeah, all that's been cut out. We're not
Oh
even
wow!
pens or anything. So you can go and get information, or you can go and get a cappuccino, but you can't go and get a pen or like a phone charger or anything that they used to distribute, which I think is a good thing. They're tchotchkes, and unfortunately they influence our prescribing patterns, so we shouldn't get them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's cool, actually, to learn that. I did get a really cool. I still have them. I got a little laser mouse actually at one of those events, and I still have.
Is that with that laser mouse?
I think it's not working very
no,
well at this point.
We took the lens out for something, but I do remember that laser mouse. That's so
but it's for the better.
Sabotaged.
Sorry to have participated. Yeah, I wasn't writing prescriptions though, so it doesn't really matter. But
yeah, so it's like, I guess that's kind of the focus of the conversation today, which is that you wrote this book about the process by which the FDA approves cancer drugs. And you raised a lot of questions about efficacy and safety and what it means for a drug to work. And I want to get into all of that. But in a broader sense, how do you feel about industry and medicine as things that are so intertwined?
Yeah, boy, that's a great question.
To start off with a really light question that you should be able to knock out of the park right away.
Yeah, and as a clinical researcher, I really live that life. I have conflicts of interest. I have relationships with industry. And there's this, it's almost like a hidden curriculum of clinical research. When you're a cancer center, and particularly a cancer center that's designated by the National Cancer Institute as being like really a cancer center, right? That's the big badge that we have. The mantra is that you're going to have very active labs. Those labs are going to do preclinical experiments. They're going to find an active drug that works in a mouse model. You're then going to develop that drug for humans. You're going to bring it to first in human trials, all within the same cancer center. That description of kind of the perfect evolution of science from a preclinical to a clinical model is probably applicable less than 2% of the time. And the remaining 98% of the time are taking drugs from industry and bringing them to people. And so as a result, you have to have a relationship with industry, particularly if they're going to hand to an investigator an early phase drug that they want to make sure is a success. They're not going to do it to somebody who's not a known quantity. Did that surprise you originally, or but do you remember a point where you kind of realized this? Were you already involved in research, or? What a great question. I think I realized that as a fellow. I was, helping out with a clinical trial, and actually the clinical trial wound up not moving forward. But I went, I trundled along behind my mentor, who's this fabulous leukemia researcher whose name is Rich Stone, who's at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. And Rich introduced me and kind of showed me the ropes, but it involved meeting with people from industry. And there were kind of formal meetings where you'd be in a conference room without any windows and you just focused on development of the drug and the science of the drug and the PowerPoint presentation, and you'd start to hash out a protocol. But then there were the meetings you would have over coffee or over a beer or at a restaurant where you also got to know them. And, it's what we know in science. Science, so much of it is science, but so much of it is relationships. And so much of success in science isn't necessarily that you have the best and the brightest idea, but that you have an office next to somebody else and you run into them and you chat over coffee and you develop ideas together. And the same is true when working with industry. It's a lot about personalities. And, when I'm considering participating in a clinical trial, I'll think a lot about the science and the mechanism of action and the patient population and whether I think this is something that, has a chance of being successful. I'll also think about the personalities of the people involved, the other investigators, whether these are smart people I want to work with, and that kind of goes into the success of a development plan.
So are the industrialists organizing the teams of researchers in a sense? Are they kind of providing like a recruiting platform for these bigger projects?
Yeah, because I don't totally understand how, because I understand the model that you mentioned that you said was about 2%, which is that
the dream, right?
The dream model, which is that you go from like 0 to drug that is approved by the FDA, like within the same group. But I have no idea about the structure of what you're talking about when it comes to industry coming in and
getting different groups together.
Yeah, like what does that look like?
So let me paint one scenario, and this isn't the scenario, it's just one scenario of how this might happen. Imagine you're a pharmaceutical company and you've developed the drug tumorinumab, right? And this drug minimizes tumor growth, which is great, and it's a monoclonal antibody. And you have taken it through the preclinical testing, and now you're at a point of where it's time for your initial trial, your phase 1 study, where you're going to, for the first time, try to establish the tolerability and the maximum tolerated dose in people. And you're going to start to look around and say, okay, who has experience in this disease type that I'm focusing on? So I specialize in leukemia. And for me, that means that I'm going to be good at clinical trials that involve people with leukemia. I'm going to know what the established therapies are, what side effects to look for, at what stage of leukemia we should be giving the drug. I'm really going to know my patient population. So the company that develops that drug will look for experts in leukemia. They're also going to look for experts in early phase trials, right? People who are used to giving drugs where you don't know a lot about them already, and they know how to look for the right side effects, and they know how to help patients get through therapies so that you don't kill a drug too soon, right? By thinking that a side effect is due to the drug when it may be due to the underlying disease that a person has.
And in leukemia, it's kind of crazy. Sometimes the drugs work so well that the patient's blood, right, can get overloaded with all sorts of things too. So if you didn't have somebody who was really experienced with that, you might, I guess, just endanger the longevity of the trial.
Yeah. So, and leukemia itself is so morbid, right? It has so many side effects as a disease that it would be easy to conclude that a person having a kind of a toxicity, that it was due to the drug as opposed to due to the disease. So you need to be able to discern those things also. And if you're a company, you're going to look for that specialist, look for somebody who's used to conducting early phase trials, and you're probably going to assemble a team of investigators you've worked with before. Right? And it's often the company that will decide that. Now, if it's a young company that maybe this is their first drug and this is their first foray into leukemia, they may identify a lead investigator and say, okay, who are your buddies? Who are the people you've worked with before who are experts in this disease and also experts at doing clinical trials? So you tend to have some of the same investigators working together. Now, let's say you're just starting out, you're a company and you have a new drug for a disease and you're not really sure whom to turn to, well, you're going to look to the last drug that conducted trials and look at the investigators who are on that publication and start to reach out to them and say, would you be interested in working with this drug? So, a lot of it is kind of informal like that, and it's a little bit of a dance. You start to meet each other, you start to, get a feel for whether you want to work with this company. The company gets a feel for whether they want to work with that medical center and how quickly that medical center can open a trial. Because every day the trial isn't open, the company's burning through money.
What is this explicit advantages to the hospital systems for taking on a trial?
So I always start with patients, right? What's the advantage to my patients? And I feel as if I'm privileged, and I use that word deliberately, right? It's not sort of a, obsequious way that sometimes I think people talk about how they're privileged to do something. I really feel as if it's a privilege to specialize in one disease and get really, really good at that one disease, and to work in a cancer center like I do. I'm at the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center, University of Miami. We are NCI designated. That allows patients to come and see a specialist in their disease. And I feel horrible if a patient comes to me, they've been treated with a variety of different drugs, those drugs haven't worked, and they say, I'm looking for a clinical trial. If I don't have something to offer them, I feel as if I'm failing my patients. So I start at that level, that I feel as if we aren't doing that well in how we're treating certain types of leukemia. Therefore, the science is the care. If we're not conducting clinical trials trying to advance that care, we're not doing right by our patients. To an academic cancer center, there are, of course, salutary benefits, and that's that eventually this will result in a publication, and there'll be academic credit for that publication. And that benefits a cancer center, particularly if they were on the ground floor of a drug that works really, really well, and they were able to see that drug all the way through regulatory approval. There are also to some extent, financial incentives for doing it, because cancer centers and medical centers don't participate in clinical trials for free. So we actually sit down and we work out a budget. And the budget includes aspects of a clinical trial that are standard of care and aspects that are not standard of care. Now, anything that's standard of care should be paid for by insurance, and that's through an act of Congress in 1992. Anything that's not standard of care has to be paid for either by a medical center or a sponsor, or the government if you're running a cooperative group trial.
So these are things like if the protocol calls for some sort of adjacent medicines, or they stay in the hospital longer than they would have otherwise, or something like that. Is that? Yeah,
that's right. So let's say we're doing a clinical trial and of our drug tumorminimab, and we think it's going to treat leukemia. Now, it might be standard that if I'm treating a patient with a standard chemotherapy, I bring that patient in to see me once a week in clinic. So if the protocol says once a week you've got to visit Sekeres, then that's standard of care. Every single time I see a patient, I'm going to draw labs to look at that patient's blood counts, right? That's normal. It's standard of care. So that is all standard of care and should be billed for by insurance. But what if in the preclinical models there was a signal that the drug may cause cardiac toxicity? So as the trial went into humans, the FDA said to the company, you need to get 3 EKGs twice a week every time a patient's on that study. And those EKGs are something I wouldn't ordinarily do. Therefore, those would be billed to the study.
Mm-hmm. You said something interesting, though, which is that the government is on the hook for those prices.
So if it's a government-run trial, right, then, so for example, there are grant mechanisms you can get that are specific to clinical trials. So you would build into that budget the EKGs that you would have to get to monitor the drug. Therefore, when you're given a grant by the government, part of that money goes to paying for those EKGs.
And are the pharmaceutical companies the ones that are getting the grants, or is it largely like PIs inside of universities that are running the trials?
There are different types of clinical trials, and I apologize, I probably should have clarified this a little bit. Most clinical trials are being funded by pharmaceutical companies. But, for example, I've been the primary investigator on clinical trials that were run through one of the National Cancer Institute's cooperative groups. So in that case, the cooperative group is actually paying to run the trial. And the cooperative groups were put together about 60 years ago as a mechanism for cancer centers to get together and study rare diseases. And that's all sponsored by the government. That's our tax dollars going to pay for those clinical trials.
And that makes sense because if you have rare diseases, you're not going to have a lot of people that have those, and so it's unlikely for a pharmaceutical company to decide that that's even worth pursuing because the benefit is so slim.
You got it. Exactly. Right? And there's also the imprimatur. It's, a little bit of academic cachet to run a clinical trial through one of the National Cancer Institute cooperative groups. So there's a little bit more of an imprimatur on those trials when they're published, and those trials might or might not hold a little more cachet in going to the FDA for regulatory approval.
Interesting. Why is
just because they're not waylaid by the biases that are inherent in the industrial?
Yeah, there's an assumption that it's being conducted essentially by an independent group.
Do you think that it is an independent group?
Sometimes.
Okay, because it's the same way.
So part of the approval mechanism of getting cooperative group trials open is that one stage of the approval mechanism is the pharmaceutical company that has the drug has to also approve the trial that moves forward. So let's say I'm an investigator with the Southwest Oncology Group, which is one of the National Cancer Institute cooperative groups. And I come up with an idea for a trial. And I propose it to some of my colleagues, and they say, yeah, that's a great idea for a trial. It's an important question. It's an area of unmet need. This is how we should design the study. At some point, you have to go to the pharmaceutical company and say, okay, are you willing to supply your drug for free? Right? Because you're studying a drug often you're studying a drug that isn't approved by the FDA. And that company has to say yes, but they could say no. They could say, we'd be willing to supply our drug if you changed the design of the study slightly to show this.
I don't like that.
Yeah, because I'm really curious who designs the different metrics that are tabulated, right? And how, recovery or whatever, what are they called? Remissions and so forth are established.
Well, there was in drugs in the FDA, you talked about this a lot, which is are you increasing survival? Are you increasing progress-free survival, but there's not actually any more lifespan that's being added by these drugs? And so it seems like it's...
Or radiometrics imaging, that was a really interesting one with Avastin especially. And
yeah, these are some of my favorite topics. So
Excellent.
It can be a little bit, no surprising. I guess that's why I wrote a book about it.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if you were like, no, I'm done talking about that.
Had enough.
I'm swearing it off. Yeah, read
Pages
the book.
179 to 211. Get back to me.
There's footnotes. I don't know what you want.
There are different metrics to determine whether or not a drug works.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those metrics are very, very appealing, but may not actually translate to something that's meaningful to a patient.
And
So
when are these getting set up? Yeah, just take us to the beginning of the design, maybe.
Yeah. So if you're let's start with kind of the different phases of trials. We start out with a phase 1 trial, which is sometimes called a first-in-human trial, where a drug is given to human beings for the first time. It may have undergone preclinical testing in rodents, and now, congratulations, you're going to get it. And the purpose of a phase 1 study is really to find the right dose and schedule of the drug and to start to establish side effects to the drug. And a phase 1 study typically will enroll, 10 patients, maybe 20 patients, but really not more than that. Based on that, you'll then move to a phase 2 study. And a phase 2 study could be given to dozens of patients, all with the same in the case of cancer, all with the same cancer. And then you're starting to look at whether or not the drug actually works. The phase 1 study, the express purpose of it isn't to determine whether or not a drug works. It's to make sure it's safe and to establish the right dose.
Yeah, so how do you find the people who are going to be interested in subjecting themselves to that level of guinea pigness? Are these already really sick people to begin with, usually, or?
You talk in the book about this, like the Olympic athlete of patients.
There's just some group of people who really just want to get after it.
Yeah, so I have to ask you: is are we using guinea pigness or is it guinea pigitude? What do you
I like guinea pigitude a lot. Yeah, I'll try to carry that forth with me.
I mean, if we're going with neologisms, I think we go all the way.
Agreed.
So it's a special person, and I get into this a little bit in drugs in the FDA. Sometimes it's somebody who really doesn't have any other options. They are at the end of the rope. They've even exhausted advanced phase clinical trials that might be available. They still want to get treated for their cancer. Some people are truly altruistic. And they say, I want to be able to contribute something to future people who have this cancer, so I'm going to participate in this trial. But there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance with it, because patients will often go into a phase 1 trial, an early phase trial, because they want a drug that works. But the primary objective of that study isn't efficacy. It's not to see if the drug works. And I talk a little bit in drugs in the FDA about studies that have looked at this and have looked at how doctors communicate about phase 1 trials and what patients hear from phase 1 trials versus what the express purpose of them is. And there's a total disconnect. Doctors will often talk about whether or not the drug may work, even though the express purpose of those trials isn't to see whether or not the drug works. It's to see if the drug's safe.
So who's setting up that standard of safety in that case? Is this...
So what will happen, it's a great question. So how do you determine that a drug is actually safe? A very classic design of a phase 1 study is that you'll enroll 3 patients to it. And you'll see how those patients do. And maybe patient 1 does great, right?
You're just starting with like mouse doses, or what are you...
Yeah. So, and I talk about this also. Thank you for bringing that up. Typically, in a phase 1 study, there are formulas you can use to translate the dose that you use in a mouse to the dose that you would use in a human. But you never start with that dose that you use in a human. You start at a lower dose. And the reason is you don't want to introduce toxicities that can kill a drug. In the classic phase 1 drug design, it's called a 3+3 dosing. And what that means is you enroll 3 patients into the study. If all 3 patients do great, fabulous. You move to the next higher dose, another 3 patients. If one of those patients has a major side effect to the drug, then at the very same dose, you enroll an additional 3 patients. That's the 3+3 design. If those 3 patients do fine, great. Then you move to the next higher dose. If one of those patients has major side effects, that's it. The drug's dead. You can't go any higher, and you've already started at the lower dose. So there's a little bit of gamesmanship to it, where in a phase 1 trial, the very first dose that's given is actually lower than what you think will actually work, to minimize the chance you're going to kill the drug at the first dosing level.
Makes sense.
So then you asked, how do you define what's too high a dose? So the protocol is actually written to say that if you have the following side effects, we're going to say that this is a dose-limiting toxicity. And those side effects are actually defined in a book of how you grade toxicities. Look, I said a book, like we're all analog. You can find it online as well.
But it's set up by some like third party. It's some objective standard.
Is it
So
the FDA?
the National Cancer Institute has developed standards for assessing clinical trial toxicities, and it's updated every few years.
Check.
So, and those are graded 1 through 5. So a grade 1 toxicity may be when you say, I feel a little nauseated, but you don't throw up, right? Then you might go to a grade 2 toxicity where you do throw up. A grade 3 toxicity where not only do you throw up, but you got to take medicines to stop yourself from throwing up. A grade 4 might be, oh my God, you've been throwing up so much, now you need some intravenous fluids because you're dehydrated, right? And you need to be admitted to the hospital. Grade 5 toxicity is death.
And all of these toxicities are acceptable to some extent?
It depends. So it's another great question. It all depends on the risk of the disease. It's all contextual. So I would be willing to accept a higher grade toxicity in drugs I'm using to treat leukemia because the risk of the leukemia is so high that the risk of the drug can be high just as long as it's not as high as the risk of the leukemia. So I'm willing to accept nausea and vomiting for a drug that I use to treat leukemia. I'm not willing to accept that if it's a drug to treat high blood pressure.
But what
Right?
about
So it's all, yeah, I'm sorry. So it's all contextual. It all depends on the risk of the disease.
but like level 5 side effects? Are those ever considered acceptable, or is it?
They're not. Well, let me back off from that a little bit.
It's like somebody's probably going to have a bad like allergic
Someone
reaction
have a
somewhere.
very bad reaction to it. So, you've heard of. Let me just start out by saying I am pro-vaccine for COVID-19. I think that the vaccines we have are freaking miracles for what has evolved, and they have saved hundreds of millions of lives worldwide. That being said, they are vaccines. And we have heard of people who develop, for example, the rare case of a cardiomyopathy and somebody dies. So we're willing to accept that with a vaccine if it's a very, very low rate of death compared to the rate of side effects you'd get from getting COVID-19, right?
Makes sense.
So to some extent, we're willing to accept a grade 5 toxicity if it's at a low enough rate.
And if it's seems like if it's for something that where there's deaths expected otherwise, like you said, like maybe if it's just for like heartburn or something, having people die wouldn't really make sense. I don't know if that's even a thing.
No, it's actually a perfect analogy, right? You wouldn't accept any kind of high rate of death for somebody who's getting a drug for heartburn, right? You would accept a little bit of background death if it's somebody who has advanced leukemia, because the rate of dying with advanced leukemia is 100%. So if your rate of dying from a drug is 1%, well, maybe you would accept that. You don't want it, but maybe you'd accept it.
Yeah, I'd probably rush towards it.
But you also have this differential thing that's really hard to tell so how long does an average clinical trial go? Like, so phase 1 this sounds like it's on the order of months?
Weeks?
It's so great, but both are right. It depends on the excitement around the trial and around an individual center's ability to enroll patients to it. So a phase 1 trial, if you're assessing toxicities, let's say you assess them after the first 3 people are enrolled, right? You enroll Harry on December 2nd, Mary December 18th, and Saul on December 30th. The trial will stipulate that you have to wait 28 days. You have to wait for somebody to complete their treatment for the first month before you assess toxicity. So you got to wait until Saul has gone another month. So now you're out to January 28th. Then have a meeting to assess toxicities, and then you can open the second cohort. So already the first 3 people on the study, you're 2 months into it. Then you can enroll the next 3 people, right? And maybe that'll take another 2 months. Then the next 3 people, another 2 months. But if you enroll Harry, Mary, and Saul December 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, then you might be able to open your second cohort January 4th because you waited that month. So for a phase 1 trial, you're right. Like it could, if you're only enrolling, a dozen people to a trial, you're probably finishing it in 8 months or a year. If it's a phase 2 trial, it might take a year or 2 years. If it's a phase 3 trial, it might take years. It all depends on the enthusiasm around the drug and the number of people around the country or around the world who have the diagnosis.
And phase 2 is where your dosages?
So phase 2, you've already established the dose from phase 1, and now you're looking at both safety and efficacy. Does the drug work in people with a defined disease, with a defined diagnosis? And maybe you know that historically, if you used one approach to treat those folks, 40% would go into a remission. And you specify ahead of designing the trial, what we're really looking for here is a 60% remission rate. If we see a 60% remission rate, we think that's much better than what we would have expected, and then that'll justify us going to a randomized trial, a phase 3 trial.
And now this brings in the details of what the remission standards are for. Are they different from trial to trial? I mean, obviously for disease to disease they'd have to be, but
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I talk about this in the book. There are specific criteria for solid tumors called the RECIST criteria, RECIST, where it's very specific tumor shrinkage that's considered a response, and very specific tumor shrinkage that's considered a complete remission.
this
And to
is by radiology, I guess.
yes, absolutely, by CAT scans usually, CAT scans or MRIs. And those are standardized around the world. That's what you use to determine whether somebody has a response, like a complete remission, or partial response, or no response, or even whether their tumor's grown.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we use for solid tumors. For liquid tumors like leukemia, it's all based on the number of cancer cells that you see in the bone marrow. They're called blasts, and the blood counts being restored. And again, we have standardized criteria that may be similar across diseases. So the RECIST criteria are similar between like lung cancer and colon cancer. But criteria for leukemia are different from criteria for lymphoma, which are different from criteria for multiple myeloma. And you have to be a specialist within that disease to know what counts as a remission and what doesn't.
So, but it's going to be the same from trial to trial for all of the leukemia drugs or something like that.
Yes, ideally. Though you will see that everyone's trying to game the system a little bit. So you will see some trials where they'll say, okay, these are the criteria, but look, we're introducing a new criterion that we think is really important. So we're going to include that in our overall response rate.
Yeah, and I don't know. I have a kind of hazy memory about this, but I worked for a little while in glioblastoma before I went to grad school also. And, it's a solid tumor, but there was some really insidious effects of some of the drugs we were studying that would reduce the angiogenesis. And so you would get things that looked a lot like remissions, oftentimes because the permeability of the tumor would change. But it wouldn't really result in any sort of meaningful outcome for the patient. And so there's this like disconnect that I became aware of for the first time in the idea of what a remission means on paper versus what it really means for a human being who's going through it.
It's great insight, and it can cut both ways. So you can have something that on a CAT scan looks as though it's a remission, but in reality it isn't. Right, you're just having some shrinkage of inflammation around something as opposed to the actual tumor. The opposite can occur also. So there were new treatments that were introduced called checkpoint inhibitors for the treatment of melanoma. In fact, that's what former President Jimmy Carter was treated with. And the initial studies, they started to get these CAT scan results back and said, oh man, this drug doesn't work at all. These tumors aren't shrinking. What turned out is that the tumor was actually shrinking, and they were seeing leftover inflammation, and people were living longer for the first time. I mean, first time in decades of trying things to treat melanoma. They finally had a drug that worked and couldn't tell at first.
It's fascinating.
So that can complicate things. So you have some drugs that really kind of don't follow those RECIST criteria. What's even more frustrating is that when you have drugs that are used for solid tumors, and they submit their results from local radiologists and their reads of whether a tumor has gotten smaller, stayed the same, or gotten larger, and then you gave the exact same scans to expert radiologists who are at FDA, they would disagree 33% of the time.
Wow.
So one person's read of whether or not a tumor is worse, the same, or better differs from another person's read of whether it's worse, the same, or better 1/3 of the time. And those are the scans that are being used to approve some of these drugs.
Yeah, that sounds like that creates a lot of complication for the system. And so I guess the question is like, what do you think works really, really well? And what do you think are the things that need to be overhauled in order for everything to start to make more sense?
Like the standardization?
Well, yeah, because I mean, like the bottom of the place where this all bottoms out is that there are corporations that are producing substances that are very, very expensive, and they make a lot of money off of them. And they have it in their best interest, even if the drug doesn't work, to bring it to market because it takes a long time to figure out if it doesn't work. The punishments are, honestly, if you look through history, not that severe. So there's not really a huge...
Well, they do want it to work because they want a bestseller.
They absolutely
do.
They do. And so, but some fraction of the drugs brought to market don't have to be bestsellers because the things that really work are the things that are going to really bring up the bottom line. And so what happens is that you run the risk that things get approved because of all of these hard to pin down standards that don't actually help. And so people are spending the last months of their lives taking super toxic substances when really, if somebody was like, yo, this stuff doesn't work, just spend the last months that you have with your family, with your kids. Like, that's what I would do. And they don't get to hear that. And so you have this kind of this extension and this fight that people maintain. And so if you had clearer metrics, it might be easier to say which way to go.
Yeah, that's it. It's a great point. So the clearest metric we have is survival, right? Radiologists can debate the size of a tumor until darkness. Most of us agree on whether someone's alive or dead. Right? I mean, just to break it down to its simplest terms.
That's what I would want to know for sure. If I was facing a terminal disease, like, is this going to give me meaningful time or not?
So if I can unpack that a little bit, there were two aspects to that brief response that you just gave. One is, are you going to have more time? The second is, are you going to have meaningful time? So very and casually, what we say is that the FDA approves drugs based on lives longer or lives better. So does a drug allow somebody to live longer? That seems like a pretty clear benefit. Or does a drug allow somebody to feel better and have a better quality of life, what we call patient-reported outcomes, for those final few months of life? So those are very clear-cut, but people can get charmed by the response rate, by whether or not a tumor shrinks. A tumor shrinking often will correlate with somebody living longer. But often, it doesn't correlate with that at all.
Which is surprising from like just an outside perspective. It doesn't totally make sense, but I think there's probably a lot of other things happening in the body when you stick some sort of super active molecule inside of it. What do you attribute it to?
It's, tumor shrinkage can be transient and tumor growth can be quick. That's part of it. The other part of it is...
Is that because you're like selecting for something really nasty potentially?
Well, you may be. So there's a truism in the treatment of people who have acute leukemias, which are very aggressive types of leukemias. And that is that if we give toxic enough drugs, we can always improve the remission rate, the percentage of people who go into a remission at the initial treatment, but it's often at the expense of more people dying from the toxicities. So when you look at the overall survival comparison, it's the same. Because
the remission just means you've blown up their blood, basically. Like you've cooked everything pretty much. Maybe all the white blood cells or something.
I will sometimes probably harshly refer to this as exploding a bomb in my patient's bone marrows, right? We wipe everything out and then we wait to see what grows back. And hopefully it's the good stuff, right? Hopefully it's the good cells that grow back. But sometimes if you wipe everything out of a person's bone marrow, they're severely immunocompromised and will get an infection and die or bleed to death because their platelets will be too low.
Yeah.
So there's a trade-off, right, with these toxicities that we talked about a little earlier, what we're willing to accept in the setting of a disease that itself is extremely toxic. As we increase those toxicities, we often will increase the efficacy of our treatment, but at the expense of more people dying. Therefore, it doesn't improve the average overall survival. Everything evens out.
Yeah. Gosh, this was really... So the last disease I worked on, like I said, was glioblastoma before I completely changed fields and went into physics and all this other stuff, because it was so depressing that these patients would come in, we had a clinical lab, that my PI was also a surgeon, and it would just be these situations where the standard of care, oftentimes you're giving people surgeries that they might extend their survival, right? Because you're like unburdening them of this pressure on their head, but they're like having seizures and this, it's just, you're prolonging this life that's just kind of like not a good place to be at in the first place. And most of the patients want to do that. At least they hear survival and they think, okay, this is good. But there's, it's just, leukemia, I think, has some great victory stories compared to glioblastoma.
We do. And, we've kind of gone to a dark place in cancer therapy in talking about all these deaths and how, there are some trials that are built to win and in, talking about not giving patients false hope. But we do have our victories. We do have our drugs that have been developed that have entirely changed the natural history of some of these cancers to the point where the cure rates are high and people treated with these drugs have the same survival as someone who never had a cancer diagnosis at all.
Wow.
I mean, I pulled up a Our World in Data chart about this. And so 5-year survival rates for cancer in the US, if you take all cancers, and they're comparing the 5-year survival rate in 1970 to 2007, and it's gone up 67% in that time. So it's just like, on average, like, sure, there's some noise in the data, but there is like an amazing extension of life for people. And you can argue back and forth about the quality of the life that's being extended. And I think that that's the question, where it's just like, when it comes to death, no one wants to die. The longevity research is so popular and such a pie in the sky idea, because it would be amazing to be able to live, 200 years and to have the biological functionality of somebody who's, 35 for that entire time, no degradation whatsoever. Like, we want that. I mean, it depends on the day, I guess. Like, some days I want it more than others. But
Funny.
we had a philosopher the other day on the show, and he was like, if you ask people like what moments of their lives they would want to like take on for eternity, almost no moments of their lives would they take with them when they really like sit down to start to think about it. And so I've been thinking about that a lot too, but that's besides the point. The question here is like, what do you think works about the way in which patients are taking these drugs and what doesn't? Like, how many of the drugs are so toxic that people's lives are just shattered versus how many people are really, really doing better, and their 10-year survival rates are also fantastic? And like,
and maybe the dangerous frontiers aren't in cancer therapy even. Like, it seemed like we were talking about medicine for heartburn at the beginning of the show, but I know that there's a lot of prescription medicine going into the psych world, and it's like, it gets in that place, you're like judging, like, survival isn't so much the key, right? And so it's a really interesting situation where toxicities can be a lot more meaningful in the long, I don't know. This is getting to be a convoluted set of questions.
I mean,
yeah, but I am really curious what works and what doesn't work about this methodology that's in place.
So I first want to respond to your philosopher from the other day. There was one point when I was giving a talk at the American Society of Hematology, and I was talking about quality of life in the setting of leukemia, and I said, well, I guess death would be assumed to be the ultimate bad quality of life. And then a quality of life expert got up to the microphone and said, well, actually, there have been some metaphysical studies that say that death may not be as bad a quality of life as we think. Which I love. It's an untestable hypothesis, however.
I mean, I think there's something to, like, I think that ties into the question that we're asking, which is like, is death the worst thing?
Yeah, you
or
must
are there
see a lot of
worse
death as
than
a doctor, right? You must see people like there's, I don't know, I've lost some people recently, and it's interesting how when people pass that there's this moment where it actually does seem to be a relief in a sense for them, as like horrible as that seems. But
yeah, there's another old joke about how you feel so sick you're worried you're gonna die, and then you get sicker and worry that you won't.
Oh God, I believe it.
If you've ever had a really bad stomach bug, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
There's, I can back up a little bit about this. People don't enter therapy thinking that they're going to die. People enter therapy because they're hoping they're going to live and the therapy's going to work and they're going to live longer and they're going to live better. So part of the initial discussion we have with people is what are the chances that that will actually happen? And then different people are more risk averse than others. So, for example, with a certain type of therapy, I can offer older adults with acute myeloid leukemia. They have a pretty poor prognosis. Their chance of being alive 5 years after their diagnosis, if they have acute leukemia, is generally less than 10%.
Wow.
Okay. And let's say I can offer a therapy where their chance of going into remission is 50% and their chance of being alive 15 months from now is 50%. Those are real numbers. Those are real numbers from a type of therapy that I can offer. And once we get through the first couple of months of adjusting the doses and dealing with side effects, in general, people are at a pretty good place with their quality of life. It's not perfect, right? A lot still complain of fatigue. There are a lot of visits to the doctor's office. That's all impacting quality of life. But it's not awful. And that's true for most people. Now, if you're the sort of person who goes to Vegas pretty often and you hear those numbers, you're going to say, hell to the yeah, bring the therapy on. Let me try it. I'm going to win. I'm going to be fine. I'm not only going to live 15 months, I'm going to live 3 years. I'm going to show you, doc, which is great. And I have other patients, and I just saw a gentleman who was like this, where they say, every time I mention a side effect, they say, oh my God, I don't know that I can take that. And for them, the thought of the therapy itself and those side effects are worse than what they're experiencing with their diagnosis. So I think just to put it in context, most of my patients, the vast majority of my patients are not miserable for most of the time that they're being treated. But if they are, we've got to stop the treatment and reassess. And some of it is physical and some of it's psychological. So I wrote another book called When Blood Breaks Down, which is about leukemia and I follow 3 patients through their stories of leukemia. And in it, I have one patient who's older who, is pretty happy with his life. He lived a good life. He raised a great family. His kids adore him. He's got grandkids and he's good. Like he's basically said, you know what? I don't know that I want to be in the hospital. I don't know that I want to be treated. Let me go home. And in the book, I write about how his kids say, what are you saying? We don't want you to die. Mom doesn't want to be alone. You need to take the treatment. So he agrees to take the treatment. When I have patients who are in that scenario where they do it more for other people, even though it really goes against what they want, they tend to have a pretty miserable experience on the chemotherapy. They tend to experience every side effect. And in the book, I write about how he had all these side effects. He was just miserable the entire time until finally he could say, you know what? I don't want any more. And the kids saw what he went through and said, okay, we're good with that. So I really think maybe a theme of this is that it's all contextual, right? The side effects we're willing to accept from a drug are contextual with how devastating the disease is. And I think a person's experience, their quality of life going through this are all contextual with their personality and what their goals are. And I think the greatest contribution I make to my patients is trying to be aligned with their goals at the very beginning and making sure that I'm offering the therapy that's going to get them to those goals.
Do you have a sense, and maybe this ties into exactly what you just said, but can you see a patient that you think is, okay, this patient's going to do really well on this trial? Do you have some like sixth sense about being able to predict how someone's going to, just that you're kind of in the back of your head keeping score with, or is it just completely ridiculous spread and, no way of knowing?
It's ridiculous spread and no way of knowing.
Yeah.
I wish I could predict that a priori. There are people I thought would just do fabulously on a trial. They'd go into remission. They'd be wonderful, and they crashed and burned. There are people I hesitated to put on a trial because I just didn't know if they could make it through it, and they are alive and well years later.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
I've seen perfectly healthy, fit patients crash and die. I've seen folks, one story I like to tell, there's a drug that's now approved on the market and has been for years. And I enrolled a woman onto the trial that eventually led to its approval. And she, rode one of those like scooters in to see me. She was a heavyset woman. She was on oxygen. She talked to me about how she hadn't been down the stairs to her cellar. This is when I was practicing in Ohio. We don't have cellars here in Florida anymore. She hadn't been down to her cellar in years because she just couldn't walk and couldn't make it. And I thought to myself, is she going to qualify for this trial? Should I do it? And I finally decided to do it. Lo and behold, she had this almost miraculous response to this drug. No longer needed the oxygen, no longer needed the scooter, and for the first time could go all around her house, right? So you have these stories at both ends of the spectrum. I've treated people for acute leukemia. I've seen 18-year-olds die, and I've seen 80-year-olds laugh at me as they work out on the treadmill every day. So you honestly can't tell just by looking at somebody, and that's why I think oncologists often come across as being macabre because we talk about death a lot, but we've got to give that spectrum of what things could look like because we just can't tell looking at somebody.
Yeah, it's so incredible. I knew this. I had a friend, an elderly woman, back when I lived in San Francisco. I used to take care of her horses, and she fell down one time and went to the hospital, and they discovered like an entire one of her vertebrae had been like eaten by cancer. She had lymphoma, like all this stuff. They gave her 6 months to live, and she was like, no way is that going to happen. And she lived for 10 years after that, actually. It was just unbelievable. And but then, you also have like young friends who are taken out when they're 27 and stuff by like colorectal cancer or something crazy. And it's just like, what is going on? There's just seems to be no rhyme or reason to this whatsoever. It's just
there isn't, and that's why sometimes patients will ask me, "How long do I have, doc?" And I would say, "Are you kidding me? I'm not going to be that doctor that you say the doctor told me I only had 3 months. Then you're going to be alive 5 years from now." So I tend to give ranges. I'll give an average if a patient asks for it. Not everyone wants to hear a number, by the way. So
interesting.
I don't assume that someone wants to know, even when a well-meaning child or spouse will say, "So, what's the average survival?" I always turn to my patients and say, "Is this a number you want to hear?" And I will tell you about 3/4 of the time they say no.
Wow,
Don't want to
3/4
hear
of
it.
the time.
I would think people would want goals. That's it. Or like the milestones would be useful or something.
Yeah, so what are they asking you about then? Like, how do they
So
make the decision?
They make the decision based on, we talk about short-term goals and long-term goals. And sometimes it helps that I'll give them my poster child superhero stories, and I'll give them worst case scenarios of what could happen. So I kind of not bookmark it. I put bookends on it so that people have a sense of what's possible. If I were hearing that, I'd probably grab on to the superhero story. I think a lot of people do. We call that chasing the tails of the survival curves, right? But a lot of times in that very first meeting, they're not ready. They don't want to know. They want to know, what am I going to expect in the next month? And then once they've gone through that, a lot of times people will turn back to me and say, "Okay, I'm ready to talk now about what the statistics look like."
It's like basically they need time to be able to process what has happened.
Just rewrite their worldview, I guess, around it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's both of those are good phrases. They need to process it, and that's iterative. So part of the talk I have with people often is, I'm throwing a lot of information at you. If I were sitting in your chair, I would maybe absorb 20% of it. So don't feel bad about asking questions of things we already covered.
Nice.
Right? And so I'm trying to give them permission to process, revisit, process, and get through it.
What does this do to you as a human being? Like,
that's exactly what I was gonna ask.
Yeah, like how does you're like Atlas out there? Just I feel for all these doctors. I toyed with the idea of going to med school and all of that, but ultimately my summer working in a trauma in an ER, and it was just insane. Like it was like every horror movie all at once,
The man
all
won't-
day,
he-
every day.
He won't watch me pop a blister.
Yeah, I've had enough. I've had enough.
Well, whose blister is it? It depends.
Neither. Does not matter.
Anastasia is our resident
Yeah,
surgeon around here. Yeah,
He's like, I've seen enough. I don't need it.
but yeah, what do you feel like at the end of the day? What do you make of this in like personally inside of your own life? Has it changed the way that you view life from day to day? And I mean, that's kind of a cliche question, but I think maybe you can illuminate what it feels like to carry all that weight.
So it's a good question. You can imagine that if I'm at a dinner party, which hasn't happened very much during COVID, let me tell you, but if I'm at a dinner party and somebody says, "What do you do?" and I tell them, and they ask what you specialize in, and I say leukemia, it generally grounds the conversation to a halt. Like, I don't know if you read any of the Far Side comics.
Oh yeah.
Right? There was one where there's a dog party, and one dog is like, "Oh, my master took me out for a walk. Oh, I got to run in the park." And then another dog says, "The vet told me I have fleas," and all the dogs go like this, and they say dog faux pas. Right? It grinds the party to a halt.
Interesting.
But
because I can see that going the other way, where if everybody's like, "Hey, actually, could you take a look at this thing over here or whatever?"
I've gotten that too. I've gotten that too.
Hey, we got a doctor over here, everybody. Yeah, that kind of thing.
But it's
No,
also.
we're not having an affair. I'm just checking out a rash.
But I mean, like, for me, I'm like, if I ran into somebody who spent their life so close to this ultimate thing that we're all speeding towards, like, that would be the rest of the night. We would be talking about what that was like. Is that just not polite society?
It's so let me circle back to answer your question first about what it's like to do this. There's a dirty little secret about oncologists, and that is that I'm not the one telling people they have cancer. I'm the one who's telling them what we can do about it.
Got it.
So it's not as depressing as people think. I mean, I look at it with a lot of hope. So someone has just been told you have leukemia, you got to go see Sekeres in Miami. And they come into my office, and, as one of my best friends said, leukemia needs a better press agent, right? I mean, you hear leukemia and you think, that's it, I'm done. And then I walk in the room and say, okay, let's talk about your diagnosis. I go over the biology of it because I think that people understand the biology. They understand the treatments better and what the goals are. And here's what we're going to do about it. And I'm talking about things that are months in the future. And then if they ask about survival, I'll talk about things that could involve years or cure. So, I mean, I find it hopeful what I do. The worst part of my day is when someone's cancers come back. And, I would say most of the time my patients know it's back. They don't need me to tell them. They know it's back. They feel bad again. They recognize that feeling from their diagnosis. And they're coming to me with, what can I do next? Right? And then we talk about what options are. And they might take one of those options, or they might say, you know what, I'm good. I've had enough. And then our relationship changes a little bit. It's no longer together we're going to, use your battle analogy of the moment. We're going to fight this. We're going to march together. We're going to tackle this and get rid of this leukemia. And it changes to, let's focus on what your goals are and what can we do to achieve those goals. And let's talk about what's going to maximize your days left on this earth, weeks left on this earth. So there's a different way, I guess, of looking at it. I have very close relationships with my patients because also the disease that I treat requires a lot of intensive treatment. So I see my patients very often, sometimes for years on end. Sometimes I'll see them every week or two for a couple of years. So you build close relationships and you get to know each other. But it's I look at it as a journey you walk together. Again, I find great joy in trying to help people identify their goals and trying to meet those goals.
And it seems like just as a physician, being around this cycle of life is probably way healthier than the rest of us who hardly ever see somebody who's dying until it's, want somebody really close to us or something. It's like our society has become increasingly averse to death. It seems, it's like we used to have open casket funerals, and I feel like people would even have bodies in the house. Actually, for most of human history, let's be honest, there's probably bodies like freaking everywhere all the time. And so I think that's probably actually really healthy in terms of like confronting it on a daily basis and making decisions that keep your ultimate mortality in focus to some extent. And
yeah, because this process of like set your goals is a process of always remembering your own mortality. And I wonder how it would change people that walk around every day that are like, oh, I don't like to think about death. To really sit down and be like, yo, you have this many months left, best case scenario.
It's always later than you think.
Yeah, it's always later than you think.
So getting back to your question about, gee, would you be talking about this all night, right? You're talking about these really heavy issues. I don't know that I talk about it all night. I think it's a constant awareness of what we're doing. So when I'm with other oncologists, we realize that I think there's a pretty similar personality to parse out what's important and what's not important. And, I think kids of oncologists have this running joke that their parents just minimize any health condition they have as long as it's not cancer, right? And my kids will reflect this back to me almost daily, that they'll come with some complaint and I'll say, is it growing? It's not growing anymore? Not cancer, you're fine. But it does kind of put things, honestly, it puts things in perspective, right? Maybe pathologically, right? Maybe as oncologists, we minimize things that are really important to other people and affect or to ourselves. And we're willing to accept a lot more calamity in our life because it's not cancer.
Does it change how you think about like consciousness and the universe and the spirit and like all of these highly non-scientific things just to be around this?
Yeah, I think I think a lot about connectedness and our relationships with other people. And you value kind of I would say I value the quotidian, right? You value the commonplace in life and learn to appreciate it. And you don't just brush it aside. I think as oncologists, you tend to not put things off as much as well. So if your family's like, gee, we always wanted to go to France, well, let's go to France.
Nice.
Gonna do it, right? Because every single day I meet someone who was putting things off until retirement, and then within the year after retirement, they get cancer.
Yeah, that was a huge factor for me, at least, in starting this podcast and changing a lot of the things that I structured my life around, where I caught myself, I would be in lab and I would be sitting at the bench and I would be doing an experiment and I would be looking outside and I would be counting, like, how many nice days do I have left in my life? Like, I'm going to live until I'm 80.
She's Russian also, by the way, so...
I'm like, I was just like, it just was so urgent and so alive constantly, where I was like, okay, I'll live until I'm 80. There's like X number of nice days, even in the nicest place in the world. There's just a finite number of them. And you get to the point where you realize that they're dripping past.
I think the interconnection, like you said, is it's kind of the final frontier of understanding yourself in the context, again, of everything. I always make this analogy on the show, like you couldn't live without that tree outside your window. And because you need the oxygen, and certainly like you can't live without the people around you. And then once you start to realize how physically connected everything really is, then it's like, of course it's connected in every other way. And I think that's a really important wisdom to grapple with.
And you're talking about looking outside at the beautiful day while you're in the lab. I moved down to Miami about 2 years ago, and I'd been living in Cleveland, Ohio. And Cleveland, Ohio is a lovely place to live and a great place to raise a family. And I had a career that I really enjoyed. But at a certain point, I kind of looked out at the slate gray skies, and another rainy day, a colleague of mine who lived in Seattle would email me precipitation charts that showed that Cleveland got more rain than Seattle, by the way, which
Impressive.
was kind of him, and I'm grateful.
Context is
Yeah,
always
those
important.
winters must be rough, though, getting that
The winters are
lakes
rough. The winters,
affected.
right? The winters are rough. And I grew up in New England, so I'm no stranger to snow. But after a certain point, my wife and I kind of said we're ready to go, and we literally sat down with a map of the U.S. and said, where do we want to live, and where are there great cancer centers? And we looked at where the Venn diagrams overlapped, and that's where I applied for positions. So I think also, someone who is surrounded by cancer all the time, you also, once you've made that decision, you tend to act on it.
So you got that executive motivation.
Yeah. I mean, we're on a science podcast, so that activation energy, right? Just getting over that hump and then moving forward. I think that hump's smaller if you're an oncologist.
What drove you to it?
To oncology?
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually a story behind this. And I write about this in my first book, When Blood Breaks Down. I was an intern, so just graduated medical school, and as an intern, my very first rotation was in the medical intensive care unit, and I did my residency at Mass General, which is a big referral hospital for New England. And the medical intensive care unit was a place the residents derisively referred to it as the Death Star.
Whoa.
It was a place where you had to be the sickest of the sick in New England to end up. And my very first day, I walked through the doors, and you made the analogy to the movie earlier. I felt like I was in one of those World War II movies where very slowly the camera is panning over the death and devastation from the recent battle, right? You're seeing body after body on these respirators, and very, very sick. And I didn't do any rotations as a med student in intensive care units. So this was a pretty foreign and scary place to me. And of course, my luck being my luck, I was on call the very first night. So I knew walking through those doors, I was going to be there for the next 36 hours. And at night, the other residents left. It was just me and one other resident to care for all these people all by ourselves. And during the day, so that kind of sets the scene. During the day, a woman had been admitted who had metastatic ovarian cancer, and she was in her early 40s, and she was a pediatrician at a local hospital. So this one really hit close to home for everyone there, right? I mean, by that point, we've graduated from medical school. We're in our kind of upper 20s. Some of the people there are in their 30s. Like, she's getting pretty close to our age, right? And she's admitted there with widely spread ovarian cancer, and her lungs are filling up with fluid. So she was admitted to the intensive care unit to be placed on a breathing machine. And she said, she got there, looked around and said, nope, this isn't how I want to die. I do not want to die with a breathing machine. So she was going to spend her last 24 hours there in that bed, when we all knew that. So then her husband walked in with her two children, aged 8 and 10 years old. And we knew it was also so that they could say goodbye to her. So they said goodbye, and we were all devastated, just devastated, watching this scene unfold. And the kids left. Then the husband left, and he came back with her best friend, and they were carrying like a CVS bag. And during the night, I was walking by doing rounds on all the patients, and I walked by her room, and I saw her husband holding up a clipboard, or her best friend, and she was like writing something. So I went to the senior resident who was there and said, what's going on? And he said, well, she's writing cards. And at first I didn't understand it, because we walked around with these 4x6 cards like this, right? And this is where we would write information about patients. I thought that's what he was talking about. And he said, no. She's writing cards to her kids for the next 10 years.
Whoa.
Birthday cards, bar mitzvah cards, Valentine's Day cards, right? Cards so she could be a part of their lives after she was gone. And she stayed up all night writing those cards. And then, literally, as the sun was rising over the Charles River, she died. So, people ask me why I went into oncology, and the God's honest truth, the science is incredible. The advances in therapy that we can give are amazing. For me, leukemia, you can literally draw someone's blood and look at it under a microscope and see the cancer that you're treating, right? It's right there. And there's so many gratifying things about it, but in reality, it's to have even a glancing relationship with people like that. People who have totally reframed their lives and have invited you in to be a part of that during their last days.
I mean, that's what is it about you that makes you strong enough to do it?
You know, I mean, I don't know. It's like I said, I'm not the one telling people they have cancer,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
I'm invited. I'm a reluctant visitor into their lives.
But
No one wants to have a relationship with an oncologist, right?
Yeah.
At least at work. Outside of work, maybe. And you know, I'm giving them options, and then you go on this incredible journey with people, and you learn so much from people by doing this.
Was it impossible for that woman to go home at that point, or what? You know,
Like, why
yeah,
stay in the hospital?
Yeah, just
Yeah.
the transport is just everything.
She couldn't. She
Yeah.
couldn't,
And
and she knew it was the end.
what, this is totally off topic, but I am curious, what is the end like for people in terms of palliative care? Is the medicine at the point now where most people their pain can be relieved up to the end?
Yeah.
That's good.
That's, you know, and that's something that people don't understand. They think that death from cancer is going to be painful. Most of the time it isn't. If you have good palliative care and you introduce it early, there was actually one study that showed that if you introduce palliative care earlier to patients with advanced lung cancer, they live longer.
Whoa.
Yeah, whoa, no one saw that one coming, right?
And that's the strangest part of human beings to me. Like when especially like trying to go from mice to a human being, it's like there's this weird element of us that just has this
Well, it's
push.
the spirit.
Yeah.
It's that, like, when life is pain, it's hard to push through it, and if you can make the pain go away, then it's easier. I imagine that this would be the case in mice as well, honestly. Right?
I think you're probably right. Yeah. I mean, it isn't, when you're in pain, there's nothing else you can think of. So that's got to be priority number one in alleviating somebody's pain.
And this is just basically opium of some sort of opioid chemical that's just giving them some bliss and cutting off their pain centers.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose there is some that's actually reassuring in some sense to hear that people aren't, you know, having these like writhing terrible moments at the end of these devastating diseases.
No, I've been doing this for 20 years. I can't remember a patient where the family got back to me afterwards and said that was really a terrible death.
Wow.
I mean, I think that speaks to you as a physician. I don't think that that's always the case.
I think it's that, again, I keep going back to aligning goals. I think there are bad deaths when someone's goals haven't been aligned.
Well, and that's kind of what I was trying to get to. Like, that's what really amazed me about your book, was just how sensitive you were to all these questions, right? Like, I have encountered clearly corrupt circumstances, like Vioxx, right? Like, clearly, like, people are clearly doing something bad.
Yeah, and that takes us into the realm of not fighting some life-threatening disease too. I think that's probably where a lot of the muckier stuff is going on.
Yeah, where it's like you have softer endpoints, and so it's like there's obviously corruptions, and you hear people where, you know, doctors will be like, I don't tell my patients what I would tell my family, because I'm worried about malpractice, and I'm worried about the family coming after me later because I didn't give them the treatments that would extend their lives, and so there's these conflicts that you hear about, and I think that you're so extraordinarily sensitive to these things that it's a relief to know that there are people out there who are so aware of it and working on it so carefully that they're able to meet people where they are. Because I think that medicine is so often like, just take the tests, just do it. It's especially when people are they're inside of these massive hospital systems where nobody really knows them. they're maybe on Medicare or Medicaid, and so they're not getting particularly good care. There's a lot of stuff that falls through the cracks, and so I think that it's good to see the other side of it.
Yeah, where's the joy in that, right? I mean, we're privileged in getting to meet people from all walks of life and who have a variety of backgrounds and people we would never ordinarily meet. So I'll have some clinic days where someone takes a private jet to come see me and someone has to scrape together enough coins to take the public bus. And people who've been factory workers and farmers and lawyers and doctors and you name it, right? And I think that's some of the fun of what we do, is getting to meet people and trying to figure out what their lives were like, how they led it. And I think there's, and I'm sure you're like this also. You both strike me as being extremely sensitive people, that you meet somebody and you get to know them a little bit, and then you kind of know at what level you're going to talk to them about things and what they want to hear and what they don't. I think it's the same in medicine if you're tuned into your patients. And when you've built that relationship, patients sue doctors who are mean. They sue doctors who don't explain things. So, and that's kind of known within medicine. I've had sessions when I was still in Cleveland where lawyers met with the doctors and they're like, explain things to your patients, sit down with them, like, be nice, don't yell at patients. Right? And there are always going to be some people. I mean, listen, you can't control crazy, right? There are going to be some people in the world who are crazy and who are going to sue people, and no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to stop that. But the vast majority of people are good people, and they're not out to, put a doctor in a vulnerable position. But the doctors have to lose the God complex.
I mean, there is a huge God complex there, because you're basically handing out the things that are, I mean, first of all, it's I think the most gilded profession in our society. It's the most.
Well, it's not totally a complex, though. I mean, they are essentially gods. Like, they can control life. Like, if you've ever seen somebody stabilize a trauma patient, it is godlike. It's just like, what? This person shouldn't be alive right now, and it's just incredible. I mean,
yeah, like, I've taken like wilderness first response classes because I work as a backcountry guide, and there's like one time a lady fell and she split her lip open. And so it's just, I'm like in the middle of the woods. I have this group of 10 people and there's this one person and it's not a serious injury. She just has a split lip. And I'm like, yeah. I can't sew that up. Like, we have to go to the hospital. Do you know what I mean? And it's just like, but there are people who can, and they can fix it. And we place so much trust in them that I think that there's a huge tension, because it's not just the people themselves who are interested in the pure pursuit of health. There's also so much money folded up into it, and there's so much industrial activity folded up into it, and people are so far away from it. And good doctors are rare. Like, I know people who will drive for 2 hours to go see a doctor because they're like, this is the only doctor I've ever found that I like.
Yeah. It's again, we get back to where we started this, and it's about relationships. Don't you think? And, I want to be with a doctor who's nice also. I've had doctors who aren't nice, and sometimes I've just said to myself, right, I'm going to suck it up because I need the surgeon, and this is the best surgeon. But I'd rather have a surgeon who's technically good and nice. Right? Is it really that hard?
Yeah.
I wonder if you can comment at all on, I keep trying to throw it in there, but there's other arms of medicine where there's more, the consequences are perhaps less dire. Like, psych meds strike me as a really interesting one, because especially we've seen a lot in the news lately, and I don't really know the details, but it seems like some of the SSRIs just don't really stop depression. But we've been prescribing them for years. Some of the side effects do seem to include death, not in like a toxicity format, but in terms of people taking their own lives. Do you think that those situations are more open to corruptions than something that's life and death, where the outcome is kind of squishy and there's long-term effects? The patients aren't expected to not survive for a couple of years. Like, they're going to live a full life. They're just not feeling right. or they're having
Yeah,
behavioral issues.
that's a good kind of segue back to talking a little bit more about the FDA.
Yeah.
There is gamesmanship that happens in how trials are designed, and there are, I'm not going to say every single company does this, but often drug companies will design a trial for the lowest common denominator of getting a drug approved. So, and you see this in my world. There's one classic example is that there are a bunch of trials that have been conducted in a type of leukemia called chronic lymphocytic leukemia, where a company chose what was considered a standard of care 20 years ago as a comparator arm, but wouldn't be considered a standard of care today. But the FDA accepted that as a standard comparator arm.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, who do these people hand in their reports at the end to? Does it go to the FDA? That's where these clinical trials are adjudicated.
In a couple of different directions. If you're earlier when we left off kind of in talking about clinical trials, we went through the different phases of clinical trials. Often the FDA really wants a randomized trial that can lead to a drug's approval, where you're looking at a new drug, tumarinimab, versus the standard, or a new combination of drugs. So maybe it's the standard plus tumarinimab versus the standard. And you're looking for an endpoint that indicates that somebody lives longer or lives better, right? Just like we talked about before. And that needs to reach statistical significance. And sometimes the FDA and the company will come to an agreement on what they consider to be a meaningful endpoint. We talk about this as a clinically meaningful endpoint. And sometimes, but most of the time, they don't come to that agreement.
What was the negotiation like in the case of that, the CLL drug that you were talking about?
So I wasn't part of those negotiations, but what they're going to do, for certain trials, the FDA is going to say, we really want you to show that your drug allows people to live longer. For other trials, the FDA will accept something different, like what you mentioned before, progression-free survival, particularly if it's a disease that somebody lives with for years. So, for example, in the chronic lymphocytic leukemia, the CLL trials, somebody with an early stage CLL might live 15 years. So to design a trial that shows that they live 16 years instead of 15 years is going to take the natural history of the investigator, right? You're basically starting your career and then ending it with the conclusion of the trial. And everyone recognizes that that's ridiculous. So in that case, the FDA will accept an interim marker of that clinically meaningful benefit. And maybe for that, they will say progression-free survival is good enough. Because if we wait for overall survival, we're all going to be retired.
And then the hope is somebody's going to follow up on that later. Like, do they have to renew their lease on this thing at some point, or down the road? And
generally, so that's a great question. So what do they do for follow-up? They generally do not expect that survival data are eventually going to get published in 2 decades. It's nice if it does. So sometimes people will go back and try to see if they can identify overall survival, but often they're no longer following these patients, so they can't track them.
What's the length of time that normally survival is tracked?
5 years.
5 years.
Yeah, so on a clinical trial, most clinical trials will track it for 5 years, and then they say, we're done. Why? Because the company has to pay for that tracking to continue.
Right.
Yeah. So the trick becomes when you have a disease like metastatic breast cancer, where you could measure it in overall survival, but instead a company wants to focus on progression-free survival, something that's earlier. Why? Because it takes a shorter amount of time. They have to spend less money on a big trial. Some large trials that enroll hundreds of patients, the operating cost is $1 million a day.
Wow.
So if you design a study where you can figure out progression-free survival in 2 years versus overall survival, which might take 3.5 years, you do the math, right? So now you're talking about something that's $500 million more expensive than focusing on progression-free survival. If you use the $1 million a day marker.
Is that just because it's like at all these centers and you have all these staff costs and what is?
Yeah.
That's crazy. It's huge. I guess they're making billions of dollars off of these drugs potentially. So, you
Right.
know.
So in the case of the trial that I talk about in drugs in the FDA is the breast cancer drug Avastin. The breast cancer drug Avastin was bringing in $1 billion a year to Genentech. It was a $1 billion a year drug. So sure, research and development costs are a lot. Running that large phase 3 trial is a lot. But when you compare it to $1 billion a year, they make up those costs pretty quickly.
And this leads us to, like, okay, so when Genentech markets Avastin, they market it under progress-free, or they get it passed by the FDA under progress-free survival. And then later studies end up showing that there seems to be no significant effect for progress-free survival, and there's certainly no significant effect for actually extension of life. So it turns out that there's a drug that gets passed that in one condition of trials, it appears to say that it does one thing, doesn't actually say that, but in the process of having passed it, make a lot of money. And the commissioner of the 9 out of 10 commissioners of the FDA for the last 40 years have been associated professionally with the pharmaceutical industry. And it seems like there's a really, really clear conflict of interest that arises that when the person who's in charge of setting standards has been working in the pharmaceutical industry in the past.
All of that is true. So focusing on this, we can start with the drug itself. So the drug was approved under something that's known as the accelerated approval mechanism. This is something that was created for all the right reasons. And it was born out of the HIV and AIDS era, where you had just the worst of all scenarios happening. You had a disease where we had no idea what the origin was. It was killing young people, mostly young men. It was killing mostly young gay men in a particularly conservative government. You had a president who refused to utter the word AIDS for 2 years because he felt that it was unseemly. So you had very little motivation in the government to develop drugs to treat these people. That led to the birth of AIDS activists, particularly the group ACT UP, who wrote the playbook on how to stage protests that can actually move the needle in a government, to the point where they shut down the FDA for a day. They were invited to the table to actually talk about development of drugs, and they advocated for a quicker mechanism for the FDA to finally approve a drug to get it to people who were dying. And that's accelerated approval. That was approved in 1992. And the rules for accelerated approval is it has to be a drug that does better than other drugs out there. So it can't just be a Me Too drug, right? It can't just be another version of ibuprofen. It's got to do better than what's out there. It's got to treat a disease that is devastating. And it's allowed to be a trial that has an endpoint that's an interim marker of a clinically meaningful benefit like overall survival. So it doesn't have to be a survival endpoint. You can get approved based on progression-free survival. And what progression-free survival means is that that's the amount of time a person goes without a tumor worsening, without it progressing, without it worsening. Doesn't mean a person lives longer, doesn't mean they live better. It means they go for a period of time without a tumor worsening. So the FDA, so at first it was HIV and AIDS drugs or related conditions that were approved in the 1990s. And then after about a decade, cancer drugs took over. And the year that cancer drugs were the majority of drugs approved under accelerated approval was the year that Avastin was approved in 2008. And the caveat when you get accelerated approval is the FDA says, okay, but you need to do another study, at least one other study that shows that at the very least you have the same amount of progression-free survival advantage as you had at the beginning, but ideally that you show that your drug allows someone to live longer or better. So in the initial trial that led to the breast cancer drug Avastin being approved, the progression-free survival for women who got Avastin plus chemo versus chemo alone was 6 months. They they went a 6-month period of time longer without their tumor worsening. Their 6-month progression-free survival compared to getting chemo alone.
Which is like pretty good.
Which sounds pretty good. Sounds like that should translate to an improvement in overall survival, right? There were 2 subsequent trials conducted, both of which involved half the women getting chemo, half getting chemo plus Avastin. In both of those trials, not only did the progression-free survival shrink from 6 months to just a few weeks, there was no overall survival advantage, no quality of life advantage, so women didn't feel any better. And in fact, in one of those trials, the survival was a little worse for those who got the Avastin. So when that happens, the FDA is in its right to ask a company to voluntarily withdraw the drug from the market. So they did that. FDA turned to Genentech, the manufacturer of Avastin, and said, we'd like you to withdraw the drug from the market. Your so-called confirmatory studies didn't confirm. And Genentech said, go to hell, no.
Whoa.
Which is like really unusual because you say in the book, you're like, that doesn't happen.
That doesn't happen. It's the first time a company said no to the FDA. And that's within their legal right. But what that means is it leads to an actual trial. And the trial pits the FDA's lawyers versus Genentech's lawyers. And in this case, at that trial, I was a member of 6 people who were the jury to decide whether or not to vote to remove Avastin from the market. So those were the scenarios that went into this. And in the book, I talk about whether this is, I pose the question, is this the ultimate demonstration of how well the FDA works or in how well it doesn't work? Right? Is it a good thing when the FDA approves a drug in an accelerated fashion, demonstrating that it can do that? It's trying to get something to people who desperately need it as fast as possible, only to yank it later? Or does it totally undercut the trust the public places in the FDA when it pulls a drug from the market?
What was the outcome of that?
So the outcome of my question?
Oh, sorry, no, just the outcome of the trial that went down. And I
apologize. I didn't give you the bottom line.
Yeah.
Funny.
Who won? What's the score?
So at the end, and this is a dramatic proceedings, you have to picture it in your mind. So I served for 5 years on the Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee of the FDA, and I chaired it for 2. That's the committee, when you read in the paper that an FDA committee today voted to support approval of this drug, that was our committee. And there were 6 of us who were taken from a nondescript hotel outside of Rockville, Maryland, in a shuttle bus to the FDA headquarters, and we saw this mob of people protesting outside the FDA, all wearing pink shirts. So we kind of knew what we were in for that day. We were brought to a side entrance to get in so we wouldn't have to navigate the gauntlet of protesters, and got into what's called the Great Room at the FDA, where there was just chaos. I mean, it was packed to the gills. There was a scrum of television videographers and photographers who were sitting in a semicircle around our table as the proceedings got going. And, we hear the FDA side of things. We hear the company side of things. We can ask questions to everyone. They can ask questions to each other. And then it comes down to a vote. And one thing that's unique about the US regulatory approach is that it's all transparent. It's open to the public and it's live streamed in real time. And when we vote, your votes are public and you have to publicly declare why you voted the way you did. So we voted, the vote goes up on these huge video screens in the room, and it was unanimous that the drug should be pulled from the market. I mean, they failed their confirmatory studies. So our concern, we talked earlier about hope and offering people drugs that might not work. Our concern is that this drug was offering false hope to people and actually didn't benefit them. And there were major toxicities to the drug.
But this was complicated significantly because people had developed this emotional attachment to it, right? Where like the people who were protesting, it was women who had survived, whose families were there, and they were making this like really emotional appeal to maintain the drug. And you talk a lot in the book about just you're sitting there and you're looking at these people who want you to vote a certain way and you can't.
Yeah. And I would probably be the same way if I were one of those women. I mean, imagine you have metastatic breast cancer, you're given two drugs, chemotherapy, and you're given Avastin, and your breast cancer gets better, and years later you're still alive. And then somebody comes along and says, oh, it wasn't the Avastin that did that, it was probably the chemotherapy, and the Avastin doesn't work at all. My response to that would be, I don't believe you one bit. I'm alive and here to talk about it. So this was very emotional, and I spend a lot of the book talking about these brave women who got up to the microphone and spoke on behalf of Avastin. I mean, I can't imagine it. The three of us are sitting here at a podcast. We're used to speaking in, public forums and getting up, and, our heart races a little bit when we do it, but we do it. We kind of know what the pattern's going to be, right? And I just kept thinking about these women who aren't public speakers, who are getting in front of the hundreds of people in the room, the thousands of people who are watching on live stream or on national television, and telling their story of cancer. All the kudos in the world to them, but this was very emotional for them and very personal, to the point where a couple of them brought photo albums with them. So when we started talking about quality of life, they would hold up their photo albums and say, here's my quality of life. You're going to argue with this. Wow, right? I mean, it was incredible. But like I said, all of my, admiration for these women and for what they did.
And are these the same 6 doctors that are initially approving the drug as well?
It's a great question. The initial 2008 panel was a different panel of doctors. And the panel switches over. So with ODAC, with that FDA committee, you serve for 3 years in your entire career, and that's it. So I got an extra 2 because I chaired it. I've since been invited back as a special government employee to an ODAC that met in this fall. But that's it. That's it for your lifetime. So no, those 2008 members were long gone by the time we sat and had an ODAC meeting where we said, yeah, we think Avastin should be pulled from the market, and then we went to the trial and said the same thing.
Gotcha. And I assume these are specialized committees to some extent. Like, are you looking at psych drugs too, or this is just oncology stuff?
So it's another great question. This is just a cancer committee, just a cancer drug committee. But one of the criticisms of us was that we didn't have any breast cancer specialists on the committee.
Fair enough.
So you can argue about that, about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And I talk a little bit about this in Drugs in the FDA. You can certainly argue it's a bad thing, right? I'm not a breast cancer doctor. I haven't been prescribing drugs like Avastin. I can't reflect on 20 years of treating breast cancer patients when I'm coming to a decision. On the other hand, I'm also not bringing those emotions with me to making the decision. So I kind of play out this scenario in the book. What if I had enrolled a patient on an Avastin study and she developed a bacterial infection and sepsis and died the week beforehand? What would I take into that committee meeting in my impressions of Avastin? I would think it's a terrible drug. What if, on the other hand, the week before I saw one of my patients who's alive for 10 years on Avastin? What would I take into the committee then? So I think it's probably a good thing to not have those emotions that you bring into it. The other aspect of it is, we were talking earlier about the end of life and these conversations about offering chemotherapy. What if I have a breast cancer patient who is at the end of the line and I don't have anything else to offer her? I don't even have a clinical trial I can offer her. That is what I said is my worst day. I hate that. If I have somebody who's really motivated to get treated, I feel as if it's my duty to come up with a treatment for them. What if instead I had a drug like Avastin, where I can say to her, well, gee, there's a trial that shows that, your tumor will go a little longer without growing, and you won't live any longer. You won't feel any better. Your tumor just won't grow for a longer period of time. It might not be an ideal scenario, but at least I have something to offer her. Mm-hmm. So you probably want to take yourself out of that situation of reflecting on that, my worst day sort of conversation with somebody.
There's something about this, though, which is that Avastin didn't get pulled completely. Avastin was just, its breast cancer label was taken away. And so much of this had to do with, I won't be able to use Avastin anymore because I won't be able to get insurance approval for this specific application. And that complicates things even further because it's not like the drug across the board is taken to not be a good drug. It's that people who are on it, who feel like it's helping them, and their breast cancer oncologist who thinks that it's helping them, are now in a position where they technically, I think, could prescribe it, but people wouldn't be able to afford it.
It's an incredibly insightful point. So in the US, I can prescribe any drug for any indication that I want. I'm legally allowed to do that, but insurance doesn't have to pay for it. So if I decided that for your heartburn, I'm going to give you Avastin, which would be ridiculous, right?
That would be one of those malpractice situations.
Well, probably, yes. So that would be one. Even if I communicated well about that, that would be a malpractice situation.
That's like just a little bit above like sewing the wrong body parts together, I feel like.
But legally, I could do it, right? Because I can use drugs off-label. You can't do that in Europe. Right? You've got to stay on label with how you prescribe drugs.
Oh, that was another thing, because Avastin wasn't taken off label in Europe either.
Right. So that's another quirky thing about regulatory agencies, that in the US, the FDA pays attention to the FDA. In the EU, the EHA pays attention to what it wants to do. And, they're aware of what each other does, but they don't have to listen to each other. So it is entirely true. You may have heard these stories and you thought, oh, that's kind of baloney, where some wealthy person says, oh, no, I flew to Europe because I could get this drug there that I can't get here. That actually may happen. And vice versa. Right? I've had folks who come from Europe here to get a drug and they pay for it out of pocket. They tend to be pretty wealthy. But all of that is absolutely true. So yeah, Avastin was still on the market, just not for breast cancer. But when you had this huge public display that occurred, most insurance companies pull out and say they're not going to pay for it for breast cancer. There's no way, right? You have this very public event, the insurance companies aren't going to do it.
Do you think it was like a really important precedent that other companies were a little more wary of disregard, like trying to butt up against the FDA, or just?
I love that question because it's so timely. Do you know that this year, I think, was the first time in 10 years, because remember, the Avastin hearings were in 2012, the first time in 10 years that a company did the same thing. And that's the drug Makena, which was supposed to prevent or delay preterm delivery. And it was a similar process. It was approved under accelerated approval. Because it delayed preterm delivery. What was supposed to be the confirmatory study, which was conducted in thousands of people, actually didn't confirm the initial study. It did not delay preterm delivery. So the FDA went to the company and said, we want you to pull this. And the company said, screw you, we're not going to do it. So there was a trial for Makena that happened, again, fall of 2022, fall of this year. And once again, there was this meeting where it was unanimous. The advisors said, you have to pull the drug from the market.
I wonder if they'll learn, if they'll start to learn. I mean, it can't be cheap to take on the FDA in a lawsuit.
Well, so the way I wonder in the book, I don't know for sure why Genentech decided to keep Avastin on the market. I can speculate that the cost for lawyers was heck of a lot cheaper than the $500 million they made in the 6 months it remained on the market for longer.
Just dragging their feet, basically.
And that's like something else about the way that trials are designed, because you mentioned also about the way that patients are selected for these early trials is it's highly selective. You pick the people that seem like they're going to be the most likely to respond to the drug, and it seems like the industry, the company that is producing the drug is the one who's setting the terms for who they're going to enroll for the trial.
Yeah, so I call them Olympic athletes, right? Because when you look at the eligibility criteria for a trial, it's really the healthiest of the healthy, other than the fact that they have cancer. So no heart disease, no liver disease, no kidney disease, blood counts in pretty good shape. People who have what's called a good performance status, meaning they're able to function on their own and do things for themselves. They don't need help getting dressed. They're not sacked out on the couch all day long. And those are the patients who are enrolled to trials. Now, it's also a truism in medicine that someone who's in that good shape is going to do well, better than others, regardless of what therapy they get. So they're stacking the decks a bit for these Olympic athletes. And then there's been this movement in recent years to really focus more on what's called real world patients, right? So these drugs have all been tested in people who don't have heart disease. I'll tell you, when I was practicing in Cleveland, it was a rare event. I didn't have a patient who had some heart disease.
Sure.
So you don't know if the drugs are as effective in real world populations. And in fact, some of these studies that have come out subsequently in real world populations show that patients do much worse than they do on these trials.
Is there any sense, is there a way to remediate that by having an external institution that sets up and manages these things? So that, I mean, it just seems, no matter how good everyone's intentions are on the floor, it just seems like there's a lot of crossed biases here that it just seems like, how do you avoid them without having a completely unburdened institution that's designing and executing these? We didn't even get into the analysis of data and all of that. But
it's a tremendous amount of selection bias, tremendous amount. So the FDA does recognize this. They are calling for more real world data and even real world comparisons where instead of having a formal comparator group, you pull it from a registry of patients who've already been treated with other drugs in the country, and which also would accelerate clinical trial process. The FDA has also proposed that there might be a third arm to trials of real world patients to try to assess that, but they haven't promised companies they wouldn't hold it against them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if you have your Olympic athletes on the drug and you have your comparator arm and then you have a real world arm getting the drug who does much worse than the Olympic athletes do, no, the FDA's never said, "Oh, we'll just ignore those people."
But they shouldn't
Yeah,
ignore
let's hope
those
they
people.
don't, yeah.
Like that. And so I guess
shouldn't.
Right.
And that's the thing that I really feel like is who is pushing for this. So you say that the FDA is pushing for this, but I assume that there is a lot of crosstalk between people who come up in industry and then they go to the FDA. And the pharmaceutical industry spends, I think, the most amount of money lobbying Congress.
Not the most, but they're up there.
They're like top three.
Top three, I think.
Right? It's like the Chamber of Commerce, the Realtor Association, and pharma companies, which really like opens the discussion into real estate
and hospital
agents.
Admin and
Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is that like there's obviously a very, very, very strong incentive for companies to make sure that these drugs come to approval, because
even if just for a little while.
Even just for a year or two. And there's crosstalk, and there's a lot of money moving around. And
so like, who? I think the question is like, who's at the FDA? Who are the good guys? Like, who are the?
Yeah.
How do you even end up with somebody who's working administratively in that system who hasn't been somehow pulled into?
I honestly believe, I really believe this, that the FDA are doing the right thing. That I worked with them for 5 years. I've had a lot of contact with them since then. In fact, I'm coming out with a white paper with the FDA on endpoints, clinical trial endpoints in one of the diseases I specialize in, myelodysplastic syndromes, which is like leukemia. So I really have a lot of respect for them. I really think they want to get it right. And they are a very functional team. They really support each other, and really, there are a lot of checks and balances, I think, even within the FDA teams. So it is true that there has been a history of ties to pharma and corruption within the FDA, where people in the FDA have had to leave. That is absolutely right. I think the folks who are actually vetting these drugs really try to do the right thing. I think where the FDA gets tied up with sometimes is when there are very strong advocacy or political motivations to approve a drug. And I think we saw that with Aduhelm last year for the Alzheimer's drug, right, where an FDA committee actually voted against approval, strongly against approval. And when the FDA approved it anyway, a bunch of the members of that committee stepped down. They left. And subsequently, it turned out that some of the data on the trials that led to that approval were falsified.
Whoa.
So Right, that was a huge mess.
I didn't realize they could approve it. The jury could condemn the
Yes. So the original Avastin approval in the original Avastin committee that met in 2008 voted against Avastin's approval. FDA approved it anyway. And
so who made that
that's why it's
decision?
well, that's why it's called, for example, the Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee. We advise, we don't rule. So the FDA can approve something anyway. And when that happened a couple times when I was on ODAC, and they always sent an explanatory email afterwards about kind of how they came to their decision. It seems to me, though, when that happens, those drugs don't do well in the long run. Usually the advisory committee's right.
But if it doesn't matter if in the short run people are suffering or somebody's making a ton of money or something. It seems like it's a game of short run decisions in a sense, these corporate decisions, because the public memory is pretty short and they can keep cruising with it. Yeah, but who are the like overlords at the FDA that are making those decisions?
Ominous.
So the person I profile in the book a lot is a guy named Rick Pazder, who heads up the cancer branch of the FDA. Ultimately, it's the FDA commissioner who makes that decision.
Sure.
And that's the thing. Like, if you have 40 years of pharmaceutical executives heading the FDA, and they're the people who are making the last decision about it, and it's like you look at something like the way that the vaccines over the course of the last few years were marketed as being silver bullets that were going to stop everything, and then gradually it was they were given emergency approval, and gradually that's been stepped back to the point of like, well, the virus has changed, the situation has changed, the endpoints have actively shifted in public conversation, and I feel like what it's created is a pain point for trust in government institutions, and some of that is, it's hard to believe that having people who are pharma executives who've been to these dinners, who have hung out with people. Well,
it's like all about relationships, right? Like you were saying earlier, it's all about the relationship. Like even if you've divested from X, Y, and Z, like I assume that the FDA director is not allowed to be invested in, but that seems to be insufficient in the sense that that's still if he spent years and years at some part in the pharmaceutical industry in that whole social niche, and those are his friends, and like, it's not even necessarily that he's just trying to do people favors. Maybe it's just the way he's learned how to think about these things. And
I like that theory about kind of being inculcated in a culture, and how that may not be a conscious bias, it may be an unconscious bias. The other area where I think the FDA could probably do a better job is that when drugs are approved under this accelerated approval mechanism, the FDA has beat a drum saying, nope, these drugs are safe and effective, safe and effective. I think these drugs on their labels need a big fat asterisk that says this is accelerated approval. So far, the data look good. We have more data coming. We'll let you know.
Yeah, just safe and effective for now. Like
for now.
For now. Best we can tell. Yeah.
That would be, yeah.
So despite all of this, with everything that you both have said has been spot on, I think, about the concerns about the FDA, ties to industry, the fact that accelerated approval is paid for by industry, that's the funding mechanism, right? So they're actually paying for the FDA to consider accelerated approval. Despite all of this, the FDA is still considered the most trusted regulatory agency in the world.
What percentage of drugs that get accelerated approval are then asked to be removed from the market? Do you have a sense?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. I'm always looking for like data science questions.
No, it's a fabulous question. I will tell you that more and more of them have been pulled recently. And part of the issue is that when Scott Gottlieb took over at the FDA, he kind of publicly said he believes more in a free market approach to drugs, to drug use. So he was open to approving more drugs and letting the market speak on whether or not they should be used. So that led to a lot of accelerated approvals over the past few years. And
that's crazy because Scott Gottlieb, he was a member of the board at Pfizer. Like
yes.
That's yes. Like putting the kid in the kleptomaniac child in the candy store and being like, I know you love candy and you steal things, but don't take anything. I won't watch.
It's a great analogy. He publicly said that. So what you saw was this juggernaut of accelerated approvals over the past 5 years. And, all along I've been thinking to myself, this is going to lead to withdrawals. It has to. Just statistically, it has to. That some of these drugs are being pulled. And lo and behold, what we've seen over the past couple of years is a bunch of cancer drugs that have been removed.
Just seems like that's like not enough of a slap on the wrist almost. I mean, if people are profiting through this short-term strategy, it's like, even if they're getting pulled, it's like it doesn't accomplish dissuading the pushing of these to market in the first place.
Yeah.
Like institutional trust is one of those things that you have until you don't anymore. Like you're a journalist and you write articles and everybody loves your articles and they believe you, and then it turns out that you fabricated all of your articles. Like you don't have a job anymore. Anywhere, and it can happen overnight. And so to look at something like the FDA and be like, it has this amazing approval rating and people really trust it, it's like, that is so friable. Like in terms of...
Well, it's scary too, because obviously before the FDA, it was a complete horror show too. And so the idea of impugning it and just like, let's get rid of the FDA is like just such an untenable proposition, but it's something people can understand too, right? It's like something that people, it's like a...
Well, you hear this where as institutional trust starts to decline, the answer is, let's get rid of the institution. And you're like, that's a terrible idea, because what happened before was just unregulated and laced with cadmium and mercury and all of these terrible things. And yet you're standing at this crossroads where you're like, well, things, clearly there's a conflict of monetary interest, and it has to do with the entire healthcare industry. And that's such a pressing crisis of our time, where people want to live and they want to live well and they want to be, and medicine promises them that they'll give them that. And so they're willing to spend huge amounts of money on things that they need to be able to trust. And if the pharmaceutical companies have a motivation that is not solely to help people, like if these are not nonprofit companies, then it's just, how do you fix it?
Yeah, are there any radical reformists that actually have a chance, or
and that have good things to say as opposed to just trying to knock the whole thing down?
Yeah, there are a lot of radical ideas. I don't know what I don't know what the path is that would satisfy everyone. I think part of it is giving the FDA more chops to remove drugs. I truly believe that the FDA can do a better job communicating the fact that pulling drugs is actually okay when they've been approved based on accelerated approval. I think that would build more trust in people and more of an understanding of how the system works. There are people who have proposed that the FDA be tied closer to CMS so that you actually start to bring in the economics of drug approval, and that you have approval in part based on the cost of drug relative to its efficacy, which is actually how some regulatory bodies in Europe work.
What is CMS, by the way?
Oh, I'm sorry, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid
Gotcha.
Services, CMS. So those are some of the things that I've heard. I actually applaud any kind of notion of bringing costs of the drug to the FDA. We actually, in our deliberations, we were never able to talk about costs. And if we even brought it up, we would kind of get a little slap on the wrist to say we don't talk about costs at the FDA. That's not part of the FDA's mission. It's to vet the safety and efficacy of the drugs.
Fascinating.
So,
I mean,
I probably have to go soon.
Yes,
we figured.
Really
we went longer than we had planned with you originally, but yeah, thanks for giving us your time. It's been
thank you. This has been really, you two are great.
Thank you.
Super to talk to smart scientists about stuff, even like outside of your regular field. You're like amazing at how you understand those.
Oh, thank you.
So much.
We're just trying to untangle it all. But yeah, get back out there, doctor. I'm sure people need you more than us.
And so you have 2 books.
I do. I've Drugs in the FDA is the book that's out now, and then When Blood Breaks Down, Life Lessons from Leukemia, both from MIT Press.
Excellent. We'll put them in the description.
Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much. Take care. It was nice meeting you both.
Yeah, likewise. Have a
wonderful
great
day.
rest of your day.
All right. Take you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.